It's a major climb down for Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam as she declared today the controversial extradition bill dead. But protesters, they're not satisfied. They say the government still hasn't responded to all of their demands and that they are planning to hold more demonstrations. The government's original hard stance on the extradition law triggered weeks of mass protests and violent clashes. This morning, Mrs Lam admitted that her administration's handling of the proposed law has been a complete failure. She assured that the government will not try to pass this bill in future.
But there are still lingering doubts about the government's sincerity, or worries whether the government will restart the process in the Legislative Council. So I reiterate here, there is no such plan. The bill is dead.
But opponents of the bill say they don't believe Mrs Lam and have reiterated calls for her to step down.
I mean, this morning she's still trying to use political rhetoric, her playing with words to try to pacify this community, which has obviously become very unforgiving. Now, Carrie Lam thinks that by declaring this very controversial bill dead, dying a fine death, she thought that could just appease the people. She's very wrong. An object doesn't die. A person may die. A person cannot be resurrected, but then an object can always be remade, come in the form of a new model. And it boils down to our complete lack of trust and confidence in this Carrie Lam as an administrator and her administration. And we urge her to step down, to pay her political price and penalty.
Mrs Lam also rejected calls to grant amnesty to those arrested during the demonstrations. That's one of the key demands of the protesters. She said the request to not investigate or prosecute offenders goes against a very important principle in the Basic Law, that no one should interfere with the Department of Justice's prosecutorial decisions. And for this, student unions at 2 universities have refused to meet with her for talks. Roland Lim tells us more.
Adult leader Carrie Lam has met the media for the first time in more than a week. Addressing the demands of the protesters since the July 1st protest action, she didn't offer to resign as demanded by the protesters, but instead asked the Hong Kong people to give her and her administration another chance to do a better job. Mrs Lam has promised to revamp the way her officials gauge public opinion and will ensure controversial policy initiatives receive broad-based support before being tabled in LegCo. One of her key priorities will be to reform the various consultative committees, in particular its Youth Development Council initiative to address young people's concerns.
In recent days, several university presidents, religious leaders and social and community leaders have spoken to me on their idea of creating an open, constructive, interactive platform for dialogue with people from different backgrounds, especially with young people, with a view to jointly understand and identify those deep-seated issues, with a view that they could identify also some solutions for us to move forward.
But her critics were not impressed with what she had to say. The Civil Human Rights Front, which organized rallies last month attended by millions, slammed Mrs Lam as hypocritical, saying that she declared she's willing to listen to the young people's views, but she's not accepting any of their 5 demands.
What we need to ask is that, do the government hear people's voice? Do the government do real actions instead of mere talk or PR stunt to try to relieve the stress in the society?
The pan-democratic camp also criticized the chief executive for wanting to get to the bottom of deep-seated problems facing the city, but failing to recognize the lack of universal suffrage as the cause.
The root problem is Carrie Lam herself. She was the leader, the team leader responsible for the negotiation for the constitutional reform in the year 2014. And the outcome is the August 31st proposal by the NPC Standing Committee, which is destroying the popular election, destroying the democratic evolution of Hong Kong.
Now, with the demands of the protesters not met, they vowed to keep the pressure on the government with more protest actions. Now, this has shifted from the mass rallies we've seen recently into smaller protest actions in the outlying areas of Hong Kong. This weekend, there's one in Sheung Shui, which is a township in the New Territories, notorious for cross-border parallel traders. Roland Lim, TNA, Hong Kong.